Chapter 9 Australia. Being in Australia was fantastic. Don and I were guaranteed $700 apiece every week, all expenses paid. That meant that if we saved our receipts from our dinners, Jim Barnett, the promoter, would reimburse us. Don and I never did that though, because the undercard guys were getting $300 a week, and we were in the $700 bracket. How greedy could we be? Most of the wrestlers lived in the King's Cross section in Sydney, so that's where Don and I stayed, as well. Our weeks went like this. Friday night we wrestled at Sydney Stadium in Sydney. Every Saturday morning we taped our TV show out of Sydney for TCN 9, which aired throughout the country at noon later that day. After the taping we would jump on a plane and fly to Melbourne for our Saturday night show at Festival Hall. On Sunday morning, we went to a TV station in Melbourne to tape a 1-hour show that would air nationally that day at noon. After the taping we would fly to Perth for a Sunday night show. Monday morning we would fly to Adelaide for the matches that night, and then on Tuesday we would fly to either Brisbane or Newcastle on alternate weeks for our matches there on Wednesday night. Thursday morning we would fly home to Sydney and have the night off. Then on Friday we would start the process all over again. It was not an easy tour, and was actually quite grueling. Australia is a bigger country than America, and while the major cities have 2 million people each, it's all coastal cities. In the interior, you could drive forever and see nothing. One time the planes went on strike and we had to take trains, and there were aborigines and kangaroos running alongside the train. I had first met Jim Barnett in 1964 when he originally invited me and Jim Myers to Australia, and it was great to see him again. He told me and Don how happy he was that we were there, and that he had great hopes for us. He wanted to give us every opportunity to get over, and assured us if we had any problems, or if there was anything we needed, we should speak with Carl Cox, his booker, or Lonnie Winters, his longtime personal secretary, and they would take care of it. Jim was a marvelous human being, and really made us feel welcome. The spoiler really got over well in Australia, and because of all of his abilities, the walking the ropes, dropkicking, and leapfrogging, the Australian fans fell in love with him. To say the least, I was thrilled. The prominent babyfaces in Australia were Spiros Arios, who is Greek, and Mario Milano, an Italian. Since Greeks and Italians made up 80% of the audience in Australia and really supported wrestling, Mario and Spiros were big draws throughout Australia, and had tremendous followings. One night at the Festival Hall in Brisbane, the spoiler was wrestling Mario Milano, and the building was full of Italians. I had a pair of brass knuckles with me that night, and when Mario had the upper hand, I jumped up on the apron and hit him in the head with them. After my experience with Terry Funk and Art Nelson in Amarillo, I learned how to gauge my heat, and I became pretty good at it, but I definitely misjudged the response I would get that night in Brisbane, because in the fans' eyes, I went overboard, and a riot broke out. Fans started throwing chairs in the ring, and it wasn't like there were 1 or 2 fans coming at me, everybody in the arena was. Any wrestler who ever wrestled in Australia will tell you the same thing. They had the greatest security force that's ever been in wrestling. They were rugby and soccer players that Jim Barnett would bring in, pay $20 apiece to, and offer them all the beer they could drink just to watch the wrestlers' backs. Thank God for those guys, because without them, Don and I would not have made it out of that arena alive that night. When we got to the dressing room, Bert Potts, the manager of Festival Hall, was flipping out. He started screaming at me in front of everyone, and even threatened to kick my ass. Now, I don't like it when people threaten to kick my ass unless they really intend to do it. I would rather someone come up to me and punch me in my face than try and belittle me in front of people that I respect. So I grabbed him and threw him out of the dressing room. I understood why he was so upset, but I objected to the way he was speaking to me in front of my peers. Besides, it wasn't like I caused the riot on purpose. I wanted to make a good impression, and I wanted Don and Mario to do well in their match. I went too far and had a major riot. You know what? It's wrestling. Sometimes things like that will happen. The next morning before I boarded the plane to Sydney, Sam Manacker, who was Jim's TV announcer and close, personal friend, told me that as soon as we landed, Jim wanted to see me in his office right away. I knew right then and there that I was getting fired. I even told Don and Carl during the flight that it looked like I was getting the boot for my incident with Bert last night. Don immediately said, "You tell Mr. Barnett that if you go, I go." That was the way Don was, though. We were a package deal, and he was extremely loyal. I would have done the same for him too, no questions asked. I got off the plane in Sydney, resigned to the fact that I was being fired, and was surprised to see that Lonnie Winters had sent a car to pick me up at the airport and rushed me to Jim's office. It seemed like Jim couldn't wait to get rid of me. Jim Barnett's office was an elaborate room in his penthouse at the top of the Chevron, a 5-star hotel in the King's Cross section of Sydney. It was on the 19th floor and overlooked the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Sydney Opera House. When I walked in, Jim was sitting at his desk wearing silk pajamas, and as soon as he saw me, he lit up and exclaimed, "My boy. It's so good to see you. Come on in." This certainly didn't sound like a guy who wanted to fire me, but I knew that Jim had a unique way of doing things. Jim must have sensed I was uneasy, and was kind enough to cut to the chase. He asked, "What would you think if I made this spoiler the world heavyweight champion? Can I count on him dropping it before your tour ends?" I assured him that Don was a professional and would have no problem dropping the belt when the time came. Jim was very pleased to hear me say that, and then added, "I'll take care of everything, but do me one favor. If anybody asks you what this meeting was about, just tell them I scolded you for your actions last night." I immediately started to apologize, saying, "Jim, I'm really sorry about that." Jim cut me right off and assured me, "Hey, things like that happen, and Bert had no right to curse at you." Apparently, Sam Monacker had told Jim the truth of what happened. Who knows what spin Bert Potts put on the story when he told Jim, so thank God for Sam. Then, out of the blue, Jim told me that Carl Cox had mentioned I was a newlywed. When I confirmed that was the case, Jim asked if he could buy a ticket for my wife to come to Australia, as his wedding gift to me. I was blown away, totally honored, and I couldn't thank Jim enough. As I left Jim Barnett's office that morning, I couldn't believe what just happened. I went in thinking I was going to get fired, and not only did he tell me that he wanted to make the spoiler the world champion, but he wanted to fly my wife over as a wedding present, as well. I was in heaven, but I was also in the mood for some fun. When I got back to the King's Cross, everyone asked me what happened, so I gloomily said, "He fired me." They all grimly shook their heads, and agreed, "Well, that's Barnett for you. He doesn't play around, and he'll fire you in an instant." Word quickly spread around that I was fired and was going home, but I pulled Don and Carl aside and told them I was just ribbing. I didn't mention anything about Don getting the title though, because if I did and it didn't happen, Don would have been mad at Jim for making a promise that he didn't keep. That Friday night at the Sydney Stadium, Jim told me that the title switch would definitely happen, and then added, "And they're looking forward to getting you back in Oklahoma when I'm through with you." You know how sometimes people say something to you and it rubs you the wrong way? For some reason, Jim saying "when I'm through with you" rubbed me the wrong way. He probably didn't mean anything by it, and I didn't say anything, but it definitely stuck out to me. After I found Don, I explained the situation, telling him, "Jim wants to make you the world heavyweight champion. We just need your word." I don't know why I said we, but as soon as I said it, Don shot me a look and asked, "What, are you working in the office now?" "No," I exclaimed. "It's just that Jim asked me to ask you, and that's why I used the word we." I couldn't believe it. What a day for misinterpretations and reading into things. There must have been something in the Sydney air. I assured Don that it was an innocent slip of the tongue, and that we were still a tight team, which of course was the truth. Don trusted me, and was genuinely excited to hear he was getting the world title, which he promptly won from Spiros Arion in Sydney. Even though it was Jim Barnett's version of the world title, the Australians recognized it as the only world heavyweight title, and couldn't have cared less about the NWA title. You know how in America, if someone came to a territory with the Australian title or the Japanese title, the fans wouldn't care? Well, it was the same thing in Australia. True to Jim's word, he flew my wife over, and it was wonderful to have her with me. Jim also went out of his way to ensure she never got homesick, because any time I was out of town, he would stop by and see her, take her out to lunch, and go shopping with her. And if he couldn't make it, his longtime secretary Lonnie Winters would visit with her. Jim was very thoughtful. My wife loved living in Australia, and lived the life of a movie star. We had a penthouse apartment at the Sheraton Hotel in Sydney that cost us $50 a week. That was actually a lot of money in Australia, because the average wage was $40 a week. Our penthouse was right across the street from Jim Barnett's, and it had a nice balcony with tables, chairs, and plenty of room to walk around and lay in the sun, overlooking Botany Bay and Sydney Harbour. Don even moved in with us. He figured that we already had a penthouse with an extra bedroom, so why should he have to pay rent somewhere else? One day, Jim asked me to pick someone on the roster that I would feel comfortable wrestling against. He wanted to get me involved in a program of my own, but he made it very clear, he wanted me in the ring wrestling. I went home and racked my brain. Who in the territory could I have a good feud with? Then it hit me, the announcer, Sam Monacker. Even though he was 60, he had been a wrestler and was still in good shape. He was a very classy guy. The people of Australia really loved and respected him, and I knew I could get some heat with him and draw some money. I ran it by Jim, who was intrigued, so he spoke to Carl and Sam about it. They were very excited by my idea, so at that point, My first program in Australia got the green light. To get the feud off the ground, Jim told me to go on TV and start calling everyone wogs, which is a derogatory word for foreigners in Australia. He wanted me to use the word in as many different ways as I could, so I called Spiros Ariana Greek wog, and Mario Milano an Italian wog. I basically referred to everyone as wogs, talked about how much I detested them, and stated that Australia would be a much better place if all the wogs went home. Of course, I completely ignored the fact that I was one, myself. Then Jim had me go out to do an interview with Sam, and as soon as I mentioned the word wog, Sam reprimanded me, saying, "You shouldn't be talking like that. You probably don't even understand what that word means." I assured him I did, and then added, "You're just upset because you're married to a wog." Sam was married to a beautiful Hungarian woman, and everyone knew it, because he would always talk about her on TV. As soon as I called his wife a wog, Sam slapped me and walked off the set. The following week, Sam was in the midst of apologizing for his actions when I stormed out and yelled, "You were scared to death of me last week. You slapped me and ran away. If you were a real man you would have stayed. But you're obviously afraid of me. I want to beat you up in front of your wog wife so badly that I'll let you wrestle me with one arm tied behind my back." Of course, Sam jumped at the chance, and we were off and running. The Australians had never seen me wrestle, and this was the brilliance of Jim Barnett. He booked me against a local Australian wrestler for a TV match, and told me not to sell anything, but to just go out there and demolish my opponent. I went out there and did a number on the guy and really humiliated him. Then I walked to Sam's announcing desk and screamed, "I hope your wog wife was watching." Sam came out of his chair with a stiff right hook and knocked me on my ass. The studio audience went crazy. Jim was smart enough to realize that in the fans' eyes, I was just a manager and Sam was an old guy, so we had to show them that not only was I a tough guy who could wrestle, but that Sam still had it, and had a chance of beating me. Sam and I started our matches on the road, and Jim had set it up so well that we did phenomenal business. The one hand tied behind my back gimmick was my suggestion. If you recall, I did that with announcer Alan Ruby in Michigan and referee Dick Raines in Dallas, as well. Anytime I did something that turned out to be successful, I carried it with me throughout my career. Don Jardine used to say that my brain was like a computer because I would put things in the back of my mind and use them later when the right situation arose. Jim also brought female wrestling to Australia, and one of the girls he brought was Evelyn Stevens, who coincidentally had been dating Don Jardine for about 8 months. Evelyn arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and checked into the Koala Motel, which is where a lot of the working girls did their tricks with the men in town. That night, Don and Evelyn double-dated with me and my wife. We went out to eat, and then saw a Tom Jones concert at the Silver Spade. After that, we stopped by the Texas Tavern to have a few drinks, and then went to the Koala Motel, because my wife had asked Evelyn to bring over certain things that she couldn't get in Australia, like brownie and cake mixes. The girls were both dressed up because we had gone out to a nice restaurant at a Tom Jones concert, and as we walked into the motel and started towards the elevator, the guy behind the desk yelled, "Hey, you can't take those whores upstairs." Don turned around and glared at him, asking, "What did you just say?" The guy behind the desk glared right back and answered, "I said you can't take them whores upstairs." Don then told me to take the girls up in the elevator and wait in the room. I in turn told the girls to go up on their own, because I was concerned about what might transpire. I knew how Don could get. When the girls got on the elevator, Don leapt over the desk, hit the guy, knocked him against the wall, picked him up, threw him over the desk into the foyer, threw him through a plate glass window out onto a patio that had a big wishing well pond, and proceeded to stomp him in the chest and the stomach. Then he lodged his head up against a brick wall, and I quickly grabbed the guy by his legs and pulled him back, because I knew that Don was going to boot him right in the head. I pulled him back to save him, but now his crotch was spread open. Don looked at me and grinned, "Good idea." He then kicked the guy right in the crotch, picked him up, and threw him in the pond. I was stunned, and said, "Don, get out of here right now and go back to the apartment. I'll take care of the girls." Don took off in a flash, and the guy on the floor was messed up really bad. I called an ambulance and begged, "Please hurry, someone's hurt very bad at the Koala Motel." When the police arrived, a witness told them that the attacker was with me, so the cops asked me who I was with. I put my best innocent face on and replied, "To be honest, I don't know him. I only know his name is Tex, and he's here on Rand R from Vietnam." When the guy behind the desk said we couldn't take whores upstairs, Tex flipped out on him. The police took my passport for 4 days, and took 3 statements from me, but never pursued it further. What Don did was brutal, but the guy behind the desk was a punk and got what was coming to him. While that story shows the viciousness of Don, it also shows what a loyal friend he could be. As a friend, Don in every way is a great guy, and would give you the shirt off his back. I've literally seen him give his wrestling boots to new young guys who couldn't afford boots. He even gave Dusty Rhodes 3 ring outfits when he was starting out. What Don did that night at the Koala Motel was done out of respect for me, my wife, and his girlfriend. Don is a very special guy, but if you mess with him, there's a heavy price to pay. At one point during the tour, Mario Milano bought a house in Melbourne, and he had a housewarming party. All of the wrestlers went, and there was a local wrestler there who was clearly intoxicated, and he offered me a beer. When I told him that I wasn't drinking that night, he got offended and replied, "Oh, so you're too good to drink with me." He then turned to walk into Mario's kitchen, and the next thing I knew he came back and hit me with a beer bottle in the back of my head. As soon as he did that, all of the guys snatched him up and threw him out of the house. The previous 2 stories I just shared with you are the only 2 violent out-of-the-ring incidents I was involved in during my time in Australia. The reason I say that is because there is a rather bizarre story about me that was published in the autobiography of the notorious Australian criminal. He claims that one evening he saw me manhandling a former Australian heavyweight boxing champion in a Sydney bar, so he snuck up behind me and hit me with a beer mug. Then once I was knocked out, he stole my Rolex watch, wallet, ring, and gold chains. To boot, he says he ran into me 3 weeks later in Surfer's Paradise and I actually recognized him. Needless to say, that's a complete lie, and it never happened. First of all, if somebody had knocked me out and stolen my wallet in a bar, I think I would remember it. Also, I never wore a Rolex watch in my life. I wore Omegas, and I never wore gold chains, either. And finally, how could I have recognized him 3 weeks after our alleged incident if he originally came at me from behind? I would, however, love to know who the champion boxer was that I was supposedly getting the better of that night. Now, he very well may have snuck up behind someone, knocked them out, and stolen a wallet that belonged to Gary Hart. However, my wallet, passport, and identification were all under my legal name, Gary Richard Williams, so whoever's wallet he took, it wasn't mine. At that time, though, wrestlers in Australia were like movie stars, and I'm not being arrogant when I say that I was a celebrity of that era, because the celebrity factor in Australia on a national level was very small during that time frame, so perhaps when he saw the Gary Hart name on the driver's license, he assumed it was me. So even though it's a mythical story and he's clearly in Fantasyland, Chopper Reed has all the right in the world to claim he beat me up if he feels it makes him seem like more of a man. However, I guarantee you that if it really happened, and I don't care how tough he is, he wouldn't be able to walk around and talk about it today. Anyhow, at the end of our tour, Jim said, "I have something for you and Don. Thanks for all of your hard work." He gave me 2 envelopes, one for Don, and one for me, each containing $1,000. Jim gave out bonuses like that to those he felt he might have underpaid, but he also did it to thank us for the business that we brought in. That was a great thing for Jim to do, but that's the kind of guy he was. Then, Jim asked me if Don and I would consider staying in Australia to become regular members of his crew. I thanked him for the offer, but told him that Don had already made a deal to go to Japan, and there was no way he would miss that, because he was promised $2,700 a week, almost 4 times what he was making in Australia. Jim understood, and then asked, "What about you?" "Jim, as much as I would love to have this opportunity, I've already given my commitment to help secure Oklahoma for Bill Watts, and I don't know how he would feel if I just skipped out on him, let alone Fritz von Erich and Vern Gagne, who have a stake in its success, as well." Jim just waved that off, asking if I can talk to them and make sure everything is okay. "Will you stay here and become a regular member of my crew?" "Of course," I replied. "As long as Bill, Fritz, and Vern approve it. They are my boys." He laughed. How could they say no to me after all of the money I made them? That was true. Jim Barnett had made all 3 of them a lot of money over the years. And Jim being Jim, he talked to Fritz, Vern, and Bill personally and worked everything out, thus making me a